Genghis Khan and his family.
Oh,
What
cool.
they did. Dude, they killed 10% of the population of Earth while he was alive. They killed so many people. Like, they affected the carbon footprint of human beings on Earth.
Genghis Khan conquered nations, rebuilt empires, and reshaped half the world.
Mongol War.
Yeah.
A tomb hidden for 800 years, protected by death, by lies, by silence so complete that even the ground itself was made to forget. And now, after 1,000 years of searching, of failure, of obsession, it has finally been found. But before we get to what was discovered, you need to understand something. This was not just a burial. This was the greatest act of erasure in human history. A civilization bent every tool it had, rivers, forests, horses, fear, blood, to make sure one man's resting place would never be seen again. And for 8 centuries it worked. The story begins not with death, but with a boy. A starving, abandoned boy on a frozen steppe who had nothing. No father, no clan, no future. His name was Temujin. And from that absolute nothing, he built the largest land empire the world has ever seen. By the time he was done, he ruled from the Pacific Ocean to the edges of Eastern Europe. His armies moved faster than news of their arrival. Cities that had stood for centuries fell in days. Populations that numbered in the millions were reduced to silence. Some historians estimate that the campaigns of Genghis Khan and his family erased so many lives, perhaps 10% of the entire human population of Earth, that the carbon footprint of humanity actually dropped. Farmland was abandoned. Forests grew back where cities once stood. The atmosphere recorded the death toll in ways that written history could not. And yet this man, this force of nature in human form, chose in his final hours to disappear completely. Not just his body, his memory, his location, his very connection to the physical world. He wanted to be gone. And the people who loved him, feared him, and obeyed him made sure that wish was honored with a precision that bordered on the supernatural. To understand the secrecy of his burial, you have to understand how his early life shaped everything he became. Temujin's father was poisoned by a rival clan when the boy was still a child. The moment that man died, his family became worthless. His tribe abandoned them without hesitation. No food was shared. No protection was offered. A widow and her children were simply left on the steppe in winter to survive or to die, and the steppe did not care which. They survived. Barely. There were days when they searched frozen ground for roots and berries. There were stretches when the food that entered their mouths was spoiled, because spoiled food was still food. Temujin learned in those years something that no classroom and no teacher could have given him. He learned that loyalty is the rarest thing in the world, that power is the only language that cannot be argued with, and that trust must be earned through action, never assumed. As he grew older and began gathering followers, he did something that no Mongol leader before him had done. He ignored bloodlines. He ignored clan politics. If a man could fight, if a man could follow orders and absorb tactics and hold discipline under pressure, that man had a place beside him. This decision sounds simple. It was revolutionary. It meant that the best warriors in the steppe were fighting for Temujin regardless of where they were born. And it meant that every man who followed him felt personally chosen, not inherited, not obligated, but selected on merit. He also built something the Mongols had never had before: structure. Every 10 soldiers answered to one commander. Every 10 of those commanders answered to another. The decimal system ran through the entire army like a skeleton, giving it shape and speed. Armies 10 times the size of his own found themselves outmaneuvered because his units communicated, coordinated, and executed while their enemies were still deciding what to do. Survivors of Mongol attacks described the same thing over and over: units appearing from directions no one had guarded, at moments no one had anticipated, with a precision that felt less like tactics and more like something else entirely. And through all of this, the conquests, the empires reshaped, the millions of lives ended or redirected, Temujin kept one truth close to him. The truth that nothing lasts. That power, once it is seen, attracts enemies. That a great man's legacy is most protected when the world cannot find him at all. His death, when it came, was as mysterious as everything else about him. The Mongols, who documented their history with extraordinary care, who kept records of battles and routes and alliances, left almost nothing about the final hours of their greatest leader. Some accounts say he fell from a horse during a campaign. Others say an illness had been growing in him for weeks and finally took hold. A few whisper that he was wounded in a confrontation with a tribe that refused to surrender. There is even a version, rarely spoken and never confirmed, that he chose his own moment of departure, on his own terms, in his own way. What every account agrees on is this: the Mongol leadership knew that the news of his death could not be allowed to spread. The army was in the middle of an active campaign. Enemy forces were watching for any sign of weakness. The tribes that had been conquered, many of them still resentful, were waiting for a reason to fracture the empire. If word got out that Genghis Khan was gone, the consequences could unravel in hours everything that had taken decades to build. So they said nothing. They moved his body in secret, wrapped and guarded, while the army continued its march as though nothing had changed. Officers received quiet orders. Soldiers noticed nothing unusual. A small, trusted group separated from the main force and began moving west, toward the Mongolian heartland, avoiding every settlement, every road, every pair of eyes that might register what they were carrying. The burial itself was executed with the same discipline as a military campaign. Workers dug the grave under supervision. When they finished, they were killed, not cruelly, not out of anger, but as a strategic necessity. The men who carried out those executions were themselves sworn to silence. Rivers were redirected to cross the burial route, washing away every track the procession had left. Forests were seeded over the site, grown deliberately to look like nature, to feel like nature, until the trees themselves forgot what lay beneath their roots. Thousands of horses were ridden across the burial ground for days until the earth was so thoroughly trampled that no mark remained, no depression in the soil, no hint that human hands had ever worked there. And then, silence. Official silence. The kind that comes with consequences for anyone who breaks it. What grew from that silence was something even the Mongols might not have anticipated. It became sacred. The region believed to contain his burial, a vast stretch of northern Mongolia, was sealed off from the outside world under a name that translates simply as the Great Taboo. Roughly 240 kilometers of wilderness, forbidden to outsiders, patrolled by a group of hereditary guardians whose entire identity was built around one purpose: protecting whatever lay beneath the ground. These guardians were not soldiers in the conventional sense. They were something older. They performed rituals. They maintained the boundary not just with physical presence but with the weight of belief, the understanding passed from father to son, from mother to daughter, across generations, that this land was alive in a way other land was not, and that disturbing it would bring consequences no one wanted to face. The natural environment worked alongside them. The ground in this region freezes so deeply in winter that it becomes harder than most stone. Anything buried beneath it is sealed as though inside a vault. Researchers who later studied the area noted that the freezing conditions, if a tomb existed within them, might have preserved its contents better than any human technology could manage. And to confuse anyone who managed to look past all of this, a decoy was built. A massive ceremonial structure in Ordos, far from the real burial zone, became the public face of Genghis Khan's memory. Ceremonies were held there. Visitors came and paid their respects and went home believing they had been in the presence of something real. They hadn't. The structure was a monument to misdirection, impressive, solemn, and completely hollow in the most important way. Mongolian folklore added the final layer. Stories warned, in tones that left no room for doubt, that anyone who disturbed the sacred land would bring catastrophe upon themselves and upon their people. These stories were not told around fires as entertainment. They were delivered as instructions, as warnings with weight behind them. And for centuries, people listened, not because they knew exactly what was hidden there, but because they understood what happened to people who didn't. The modern world arrived eventually, with its satellites and its radar and its ambition, and it looked at all of this, the legends, the forbidden zones, the centuries of silence, and decided it was not enough. The National Geographic explorer Albert Lynn approached the search with a commitment that set him apart from earlier attempts. He would not dig. He would not violate the sacred land. He would look without touching, using satellite images to scan for geometric patterns in the terrain that nature alone would not produce. And in the imagery, he found them: shapes that suggested structures beneath the soil, angles that did not belong to natural formations. His findings were cautious, careful, preliminary, but they were enough to confirm that this approach had potential. Ground-penetrating radar teams moved through the Kentai Mountains and returned with data showing underground anomalies, collapsed shapes, straight features, arrangements that the Earth itself had not made. The excitement was real. The frustration was equally real, because Mongolian officials held firm: no excavation. Every anomaly remained a question mark. Another expedition catalogued over 1,300 aristocratic graves across a wide section of the steppe. The scale of the discovery shocked the researchers. But not one of those graves belonged to the Great Khan. His absence from the record began to feel like its own kind of presence. Then a figure named Maury Kravitz spent decades, not years, decades, walking through terrain that most people would never volunteer to see. He spoke to nomadic families whose grandparents had heard things. He reviewed maps that had been sitting in archives collecting dust for a century. He crossed land that had not seen outsiders in generations. He said, at the end of all of it, that he had narrowed the location to a specific region. He never found proof. Teams reported strange things. Equipment failed without explanation. Members fell ill in patterns that made no sense medically. Navigation instruments gave readings that could not be reconciled with known geography. No one could explain any of it. Everyone filed it under bad luck and moved on, because the alternative, the idea that something in that land was resisting them, was not the kind of thing you put in a scientific report. The theory that finally broke the stalemate came from someone who had spent his career questioning things that other people accepted as settled. Alan Nichols looked at the global consensus. Everyone pointed to the sacred mountains in northeastern Mongolia. Everyone agreed that was where you looked. And he said, quietly but clearly, "You are all looking in the wrong place." His argument was straightforward. If Genghis Khan's burial was designed to be unfindable, then placing it in the most obvious location, the region most associated with his birth, his spiritual life, his identity, would be exactly the wrong decision. The Mongols who planned this burial were not sentimental. They were strategic. And strategy, when the goal is permanent concealment, demands misdirection. Nichols pointed toward a remote and unnamed peak near the Yellow River in Inner Mongolia. The terrain was difficult. The documentation was thin. The area was partially under military control, which meant entering it required the kind of careful negotiation that could not be done loudly. He moved quietly, brought equipment in small pieces, and scanned what he could reach. The ground-penetrating radar returned images of rectangular shapes buried deep beneath layers of rock and soil. The shapes were not natural. Magnetometer readings hinted at concentrations of metal arranged in patterns that suggested structure, chambers reinforced with materials that had lasted for centuries. The data was compelling. Nichols refused to release it publicly. He said the political sensitivity of the region made any announcement dangerous, and he was right enough about the politics that few people could argue with him. But silence has its own cost. Rumors filled the space where information should have been. Other governments began paying attention. International research bodies that had been watching the search for years now found themselves unable to ignore a situation that was quietly becoming something larger than archaeology. The pressure eventually forced a response. A joint scientific committee was formed. Data from every major expedition, including Nichols's scans, reviewed privately, was laid alongside data from decades of other work. The committee looked for convergence. Where had multiple independent surveys, using different technologies from different starting assumptions, found the same things in the same places. They found it. Not at the traditional site. Not at Nichols's exact location. Somewhere that none of the expeditions had designated as primary, but that the data, looked at together, kept pointing toward. A supervised excavation was authorized. A small team. Strict limits. Constant oversight. They uncovered the upper stones of an ancient sealed chamber after days of careful work. The stones were locked together with a precision that matched 13th century construction methods. The seal had held for 800 years without assistance from anyone. Inside, the air was cold and still. Dust had settled over everything in a layer so undisturbed that it looked almost deliberate, as though even the dust had been placed with care. The chamber held rows of ceremonial armor, polished before it was sealed away. Weapons arranged with the kind of attention that says these were not thrown in, they were placed. Bows, spears, blades that carried the distinctive markings of Mongol craftsmanship from the era of the empire's peak. Scrolls had survived in protective containers, fragile but readable. Food offerings in clay vessels still held dried remnants of meat and fermented drink. The cold, airless conditions inside the chamber had done what no preservation technology could replicate. Textiles folded near the center of the room showed patterns drawing from Mongolian, Chinese, and Persian traditions, a physical record of the reach of the empire woven into silk and wool. And then the remains. Human remains, preserved by the same freezing darkness that had held everything else. The positioning was deliberate, respectful. A necklace around the neck matched descriptions of an object connected to Temujin's mother, something she was said to have given him in childhood as protection. A small carved token near the burial resembled objects associated with his first wife, Bort. A heavy wooden seal matched styles linked to his son Ogdi. Radiocarbon dating confirmed the correct time period. DNA analysis returned markers tied to Central Asian populations connected to Mongol royal lineage. Every result, every object, every detail aligned. When the news reached the outside world, Mongolia responded with something that was not simply pride or celebration. It was emotion at the full spectrum, joy and fear and grief and protectiveness all at once. Families who had grown up hearing warnings about this land now found those warnings had failed. They worried about curses. They worried about what they could not name or explain. Cultural authorities in Inner Mongolia felt the discovery as something belonging to their identity, now suddenly visible to interests that might not honor it. Russia watched quietly. UNESCO urged restraint. Whether this site will be protected or consumed, honored or reduced to a destination, that question remains open. And, in a way, it is the most important question the discovery raises. Genghis Khan spent his entire life reshaping the world. He spent his death trying to disappear from it. What happens next will say more about who we are than about who he was. Maybe the tomb was never meant to be found. Or maybe, after 800 years, it had been waiting long enough.